Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. I look forward to all of my podcasts and all of my podcast guests, but I have to confess I've been super looking forward to this one. Joining us today is Professor Helen Thompson. She's a professor of political economy at Cambridge University. She recently published a book called Disorder: Hard Times in the 21st Century, and it makes up a lot of the conversation that we have, and we're going to put a link to it in the show notes. I just finished reading it, and it was truly excellent. I didn't know Helen. I reached out to her on social media, and she was willing to come on the podcast. So as always, I really appreciate guests who are willing to engage with me sight unseen, and hopefully the conversation was as productive for me as it was for her. She has some really, really thought-provoking ideas, especially about economic nationhood, which crystallized, for me, some of the things I talk about all the time, but maybe didn't even necessarily have the words to explain it, and suddenly I have those words. So thanks so much to Helen for coming on. We recorded on Tuesday, October 24th. This is coming out at the beginning of next week, so I'm sure not a lot is going to happen between now and then that's going to affect the conversation, but just so you know. Otherwise, listeners, you can reach me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you want to talk more about our wealth management services, or if you are interested in our research and consulting services, or if you just want to send me comments and thoughts about the podcast itself. It's always appreciated. Last but not least, tons of new listeners. We're so happy to have you. If you have not yet rated or reviewed the podcast, it takes 2 seconds on whatever platform you listen on, helps us keep the podcast free and helps us keep up pumping content out. So thanks in advance for considering that small favor. That's all I got. Enjoy this conversation. See you out there. All right, Helen, I've been chasing you since the pandemic, and I dropped some balls, and we didn't get you on the podcast. But 3 years later, finally, we're welcoming you onto the podcast, and it's a real pleasure to have you. Are you broadcasting in from Cambridge today? Where are you right now in the world?
Yeah, I'm in my office in Cambridge today. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to have the chance to talk to you, Jacob.
How is the weather in Cambridge right now? I would assume it hasn't turned.
It's actually quite nice, autumnally nice.
Well, good. I hope you enjoy the 3 days of nice autumn that you're going to get there in Britain. I don't even know where to start, and we only have an hour, so we could sort of start all over the place. But I think I wanted to start a little bit more generally, which was I just finished your book Disorder. I think it's brilliant. We're going to put a link to it in the show notes if people want to go out and read it. But maybe just give us like the sort of 3-minute standalone argument for how you're seeing the world right now, because it's not just geopolitics for you. You're also working in the economics, and you're also working in some very serious thoughts about democratic government that I think really aren't getting enough play. So I'll leverage you up for just give us sort of the 3-minute take, and we'll go into it from there.
Sure, thanks, Jacob. I mean, the point of the book, the reason why I wanted to write it in the first place, was to try to understand what was going on in the 2010s. In particular, the 2016 shocks, which obviously usually get recounted as Brexit and Trump. But I actually thought at the time that the failed coup in Turkey in July of that year should always have been part of the narrative of 2016. And that was obviously a very geopolitical moment. And I thought that one of the problems in the ways in which the first 2 shocks were written about, Trump and Brexit, was that it was all caught up almost like in the psychodrama of American and British politics. There wasn't a lot of like longue durée thinking about what was going on. And so my aim was to try to provide that, to write a long history of the 2010s. And what I came up with wasn't my original idea, but what I sort of settled on was that I was going to tell 3 different stories and then try and bring them together. So I was going to tell a geopolitical origin story of the 2010s that would go back all the way to the beginning of the age of oil, the beginning of the 20th century. I was going to tell an economic origin story which would go back to the 1970s and would concentrate, though not exclusively, on monetary and financial questions and their relationship to energy. And then I was going to tell a story about democratic politics in Western countries anyway. And that was a little bit more tricky in terms of deciding on an origin, on a start of the story. But I decided I also wanted to bring in some conceptual apparatus about that. Mm-hmm. And the idea that actually democracies have strong tendencies towards instability over time. And then the project, if you like, was to find a way of knitting those stories together, weaving those stories together, so that I would be able to explain how there were multiple fault lines that were coming out of them that were, if you like, putting pressure not just on the democratic politics of Britain, the United States, and a number of other Western countries, but on the geopolitical order itself. And in a way, but with a caveat, the thing that was going to hold all this together was energy. And that was both about the history of fossil fuel energy, but it was also about the energy transition. Now, I didn't want to write a book in which I would say energy determined everything, because it's not that book. I probably wouldn't spend so much time thinking about democratic instability if that were the case. But I did want to say that energy explains more than most people think about the world in which we live, and that there was something quite specific in geopolitical terms about the 2010s that very much was bound up around energy, and that was the geopolitical consequences of the United States returning as the world's largest oil producer, being a significant gas exporter, and that change happening at the same time as China had become the most important energy importing state in the world.
Just a logistical question. Like, I was struck when I was reading, over how long a period did you write this? Because the things that you're writing about are literally changing in real time. So I have this vision of you like sketching out a chapter and then having to start over because something happens in the world. So how did you like deal with that?
Well, I started planning the book in 2018, in the summer of 2018. I started writing it in the summer of 2019. And I was supposed to finish it by the summer of 2020, or at least finish the first draft of it to send to my editor. Well, that ran into the pandemic. So I took another 3 months. So it was the end of the summer rather than the beginning of the summer. And that really went on trying to figure out how to make the pandemic part of the story. Now, in the end, I actually think, I don't like saying this, but the pandemic actually made the book a better book than it would have been. I think it allowed me to deal with the ending better than I would if that hadn't happened. It kind of provided a focus point, if you like, for the end rather than just a so open future. But then I ran into the fact that in the United Kingdom, the publication date was the 24th of February 2022. So that was the day that obviously Russia invaded Ukraine. And so the paperback edition is coming out in the UK anyway on Thursday, so on the 26th. And that has a new chapter in it which goes through what happened last year. Focused on energy, but again, not entirely about energy in the aftermath of Russia's invasion.
Well, great. I mean, let's talk about that then, because I noticed that it was published right around that time. And the first question I was going to ask is, did Russia's invasion challenge any of your underlying theses? Did it support your underlying theses? Did it accelerate some of the developments that you talked about? How are you integrating Russia's invasion into your framework?
Well, the first thing, to be honest, as well as being very distressed about what had happened and waking up having been to my book launch event the night before and then waking up to that news, was that I was a bit frustrated with myself because I'd actually intended originally, so when I was planning the book in 2018, to have a fourth part to it, which was going to be about territorial politics and territorial boundaries of states, the contest over them, and its relationship to long cultural and religious questions. And the Russia question, in that respect, was going to be part of that. Actually, there was going to be more on Israel, actually, in this respect in it than it turned out to be, having not done this fourth part. So, on the one hand, I thought it was a limitation of the book that in giving such a materialist account of geopolitics, which I'd ended up with, and making energy so center, that I wasn't really able to explain what happens when you have a state like Russia that rejects the legitimacy of the nation state that is literally right next to it. On the other hand, I thought, and I sort of came to this view over the first few weeks, maybe the month after the invasion, and it stayed with me when I was writing the new chapter for the paperback. I think that there is a certain continuity that runs through my story, my histories into Russia. That's partly because you can't really explain, I think, the nature of the Russia-Ukraine relationship between Ukraine's independence and Russia's invasion last February without understanding the energy relationship and the pipeline relationships in particular. Now, I don't mean to say that Russia invaded because of the pipelines. I don't believe that for a moment, but they're very much part of the shifting politics around Ukraine's position. And then I would say that one story that I threaded all the way through the geopolitics, so going back to Germany at the beginning of the 20th century, which is the question of what does Germany as a resource-poor country, minus, once leaving coal aside, what does it do? What options has it had? And obviously one of the answers in the second half of the 20th century became turn eastwards to Russia. It's an answer that actually also pursued in the 20s and the first part of the 1930s. And then you have this moment of Russia's invasion that it doesn't bring the whole thing crashing down because Germany still has an energy relationship with Russia, either directly or indirectly. But it brings the ability to legitimate that relationship to an end very dramatically. And I thought that I did have history, the historical story, to explain the significance of that for Germany, and then what that meant for the rest of Europe and what that means for the relationship between the United States and European countries, what the knock-on consequences are for the geopolitics of the Middle East around energy. So there were aspects of it where I thought, well, this is part of a continuity. So in doing the chapter for the paperback, I kind of try to explore that tension between what doesn't follow, like the way that the world in a way started again in this respect on the 24th of February, the day the book came out, and the ways in which there was continuity with the previous chapters.
I agree with you that it wasn't about the pipelines or just about the pipelines for a second, but in trying to understand Putin's motivations, how much do you ascribe weight to the rise of the U.S. as an energy superpower and, the promises of LNG and hydrogen and nuclear and all these other things in the bloc? Did you think that Putin thought he had a limited amount of time with the energy leverage that he had over Europe and now is the time to move? How do you think he understood that leverage? Because it's still a bit of a question mark for me.
I think it still is a question mark, Jacob. And I think that one can't understand generally the moves that Putin made through the 2010s over a number of issues without understanding the ways in which shale, whether that's the oil side of it or the gas side of it, was a big geopolitical disruptor. And obviously it was on the shale gas side of it that was very directly consequential for Putin, both because it meant that actually he left aside one of the Arctic fuels that had been very, very keen previously on developing, realizing it would be high cost in comparison to what the United States could export, and that the United States itself would not be a market for that, which he'd had that hope earlier in the 2000s. But also because for the first time, Russia had a competitor in the United States for the European gas market. In a way, it recreated that dynamic which is there about oil at the beginning of the 20th century when Standard Oil and Russian companies are fighting over the European oil market to some extent, then also cooperating about it, but there's a competition. I don't think we can really understand the ways then in which the second Nord Stream pipeline became the kind of geopolitical question that it was, and the geopolitical tension it caused between Germany and the United States, and then Russia in relation to that, without seeing the significance of the United States' ability to export gas into European countries, including because in Germany, it looked like to many people that when the Americans said, oh, you need to be out of Nord Stream 2 because it's not fair on the Ukrainians, that many people in Germany heard it as, well, you would like your companies to sell shale gas, liquid natural gas exports to us. So I think the puzzle in it all, and I still don't really know what the answer to this is the moves the Biden administration itself made on the Nord Stream issue, on Nord Stream 2, because it actually obviously removed the sanctions on Nord Stream 2, not 7 months, about 6-7 months before Russia's invasion. So Germany at that point, the German government at that point might have thought that they really managed to pull this thing off and not be subject to essentially an American veto over using the second Nord Stream pipeline. But actually then Scholz had to effectively suspend it a few days before the invasion actually took place. And then they ended up obviously also being exploded, not just the first one, and the second one, the first one too. So I think if we were trying to work through the way in which the Biden administration thought about the Ukraine issue in the months prior to the invasion, we would have to think about what it thought it was doing about Nord Stream 2 sanctions.
And I would imagine that was mostly, it seemed like Biden was very, very preoccupied with repairing the transatlantic relationship and undoing the damage that the Trump administration had done, because there were interest-based problems between the United States and Germany going back a long time. But a lot of it was just Trump and Merkel. It was oil and water. It just didn't work. And you could feel from the very beginning, Biden was trying to come in and do something different. But in some ways, that's the theme of his presidency. He tried to do Iran differently. That's blown up in his face. He tried to do Germany, Ukraine differently. It's blown up in his face. I guess the only one that has not blown up in his face yet, knock on wood, is Korea. Like, he has managed to repair relations with South Korea and Japan. But I guess maybe that's part of it, but just a guess.
Well, I think that, at the time, there was a lot of talk about him hoping that if he was, to put it, crudely, play nice with the Germans about Nord Stream, that they would play nice with him about China.
Right.
But that seemed to me to be like, I find it hard to believe that people in the Biden administration really thought like that, because the German commercial interests in China are so deeply entrenched that the idea that they were just going to retreat because the sanctions had come off Nord Stream, that always seemed to me to be implausible.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also struck by, and I loved how much you delved into the Suez crisis in 1956, and I'm going to connect it to the Germany conversation here in a little bit of a roundabout way, because one of the things that was really salient was you sort of talk about how at the end of the day, the Suez crisis was an example of how United States policy didn't really make sense. The United States was going to have Britain, for the most part, be in charge of making sure that Gulf oil was still flowing, and yet at the same time, Britain didn't have the power or resources to continue doing that, and the United States didn't want to be involved in the Middle East itself at that point. So you have this, okay, Britain and France are doing what they think they're supposed to do to secure resources, and the U.S. comes in and slaps them on the wrist, and the U.S. is still an energy superpower at this point. We haven't gotten to Texas failing and the United States becoming a net importer. I wanted to map that on to Germany kind of right now, because even though Germany, they made a big bet on Russia, I don't know why they keep making bets on Russia. It feels like every time they look east, something goes bad, but they want to keep going to the table and playing with the Russia card. It keeps blowing up in their face. And yet here, we're here today, October 24th. Germany is still saying we're going to do more coal and we're not going to turn the nuclear reactors back on and we're going to do LNG. It feels like there's a fundamental lack of foresight in how both of those governments were dealing with those things. And maybe that goes back to your point about instability in democratic politics. But I just wonder how you account for something that seems so obvious to you and I here sketching it out that somehow is painfully unobvious to the leaders of these states for whom these decisions matter a great deal.
Yeah, I think part of the answer is that for the European governments in particular, and perhaps particularly actually for Germany, that generally there are just bad choices. That Germany didn't just have no oil domestically in the first part of the 20th century, which was true, obviously, of Britain and France. Two, they were able to use their empires, ultimately, particularly in the Middle East, to address that issue. For Germany, when Hitler tried conquest of the Soviet Union in order in part to at least address that issue. Obviously, it's a total catastrophe in terms of what the annihilation that comes with it. And really, by the end of the Second World War, it leads to Germany losing its energy sovereignty pretty much entirely. If you then move on like to the 1960s, by the end of the 60s, at least, that Britain's realising that it might have some quite decent oil prospects. It's going to be expensive oil. It's offshore oil in the North Sea. Germany doesn't get really any share, or scarcely any share of like North Sea oil. And so it's in a position where it's not got domestic supply either of these crucial points. It's shoved out of Middle Eastern empire in the first half of the 20th century. It goes catastrophically wrong with the way in which the Nazis deal with the issue, and Germany doesn't have any international oil company to compare to what starts off as like Anglo-Persian becomes British Petroleum. They don't have Total like the French do. As you've already said, Jacob, when it comes to importing oil from the Middle East in the post-war period, it's like, well, you've got to rely on the British and the French to take care of that, and particularly the British, and then the Americans like veto it. So I don't think it's a coincidence at all. And I obviously say this in the book, but actually the Suez crisis is a fairly important part of the story of West European countries, including West Germany, as it then was, looking eastward back to the Soviet Union. Now, they're treading back where that they've already been. The Soviets were exporting oil to Germany from the late 20s and into the 30s. But the choice at that point is, well, it can come from the Soviet Union with all the difficulties that brings, or it can come from the Middle East, because the American position in 1950s and indeed all the way through, I'd say till 2015-ish. I think it's 2015 when Obama allows American oil exports again, is essentially America wants oil not only just produced in America for America, but oil produced in the Western Hemisphere for the Western Hemisphere. So if you think of there being three main blocks of oil and gas as hydrocarbons, like as the Americas, Middle East and Russia, or Russia, Central Asia, then really for European countries, particularly beyond the age of empire, just pick your poison out of what's on offer. So, and I think that then there's parallels really with the Suez to Ukraine, because, well, where gas is concerned, European countries do when they can't buy pipelined gas, or at least most of them can't buy pipeline gas after Putin shut it off down Nord Stream 1 from June of last year. They say, okay, well, we need some long-term contracts with Qatar. So actually 3 European countries just in the space of the last 6 weeks, that might not be quite right, but really the last few months, France, Italy and the Netherlands are signing contracts with Qatar of more than 20 years each. So that pattern where you just say, okay, we've got a problem in the Middle East, we'll go to the Soviet Union. We've got a problem in Russia, we're going like back to the Middle East. It's reoccurring. Now, I actually think some of that is very understandable because there are just really bad choices. Mm-hmm. I think the nuclear question is a different proposition. I mean, it's not that I don't think there's any geopolitical element to Germany's nuclear power story. I don't think it's a coincidence that France has relations with a number of African countries in particular that give it a reliable source of uranium, like from the 70s, in a way which Germany doesn't have those options again. But clearly there was something went on in West German domestic politics about nuclear power in the 1970s and the 1980s that is different, not just from France, but it's different from actually pretty much any other country in the world. Certainly in Europe. I mean, it's the Green Party in Germany have come out of the anti-nuclear power civil movement in the 70s. Then there's Chernobyl in 1986, and obviously Merkel makes her decision to set the deadline for 10 years or 11 years, however long it is, after Fukushima. So I think that's the point where we can say is it doesn't really have to be like that for Germany just by looking at the geopolitical predicaments around energy that it faces.
Do you think it'll change? Like what is next? What is next for them, and what do you think is next for the European Union? I've been thinking that the combination of the COVID crisis and the Russian invasion would finally force the European Union, the Frankenstein half monetary, half political union, to either become the real thing or fall apart. And it's impressing me with its ability to stay in the Frankenstein stage, where it's not going for the full thing and it's not falling apart at all. It's just kind of sitting there. So how do you think it's going to go next, and how does the energy question fit into that?
Well, I think a lot of the default operation of the mode of operating of the European Union is muddled through. And I think that's particularly true where the Eurozone is concerned. I mean, I think in some sense, the Eurozone can't be fixed. It can't be ended either. So muddled through is what's available. I think that the energy question is proving really hard for the European Union. And that is both a function of, in a way, the geography of the European Union. So leaving any other question aside about Orban's position in relation to Russia, it's obviously a very different proposition for the landlocked countries in Central Europe, notably, but not only Hungary and Austria, to simply switch off the existing land pipeline relationship with Russia, both where oil was concerned and where gas was concerned. And that is why they effectively were allowed to be exempt from aspects of the sanctions that were on oil in particular, that were put in place. So there's a kind of problem of unity, or the difficulty of unity, that comes from the fact that the European Union has countries that have very different geographical relations with the geopolitics of energy. If you're like in the Mediterranean, you're Spain, that gives you one relationship to North Africa. If you're the Baltics, you've got a very different relationship to that. On the other hand, and this is where the nuclear question, I think, comes back into play, it is really clear that the divisions between France and Germany over nuclear power have been really, really divisive. There does seem to have been some German concessions in the last week or so, but from what I've been hearing in the last few months when I talked to people involved in some of the decision-making within the European Union on this, it's been paralysing the division between France and Germany over nuclear power. And if you think of the story of the European Union in all its forms and its predecessor forms, European Coal and Steel Community, European Atomic Energy Community, European Economic Community, of those, two of them are very directly about energy, coal and steel and the atomic energy. I think the European Economic Community has got a great deal actually to do with the oil question in the wake of Suez. The negotiations began before the Suez crisis started. They changed the French position on it, not least because they wanted Algeria to be part of the European Economic Community to sell oil into Algeria. So energy has been a driver of the European project, but it's really difficult to see how energy is a driver of it now. You can see how they want it to be through the energy transition and low carbon energy, but when the two most important states in the European Union can't agree about whether nuclear power counts as a green energy or not, and then that affects a whole host of other things, that's really hard. And that's before we even get to the fact, the problem, that the metals issue, that the whole of Europe is in a pretty difficult position. Again, because it's resource poor and it's got to construct relations in parts of the world, some of which have been subject to European empire in living memory. And that's really tough to get around that. So I find it very difficult to see how energy can be the driver of really rebooting the European project.
Yeah, France is experiencing that up close and personal right now in Western Africa, in the Sahel. I could talk about energy forever, but maybe I'll just sort of ask one more question in this vein, and then I want to switch to aristocratic excess and economic nationhood, which in some ways were my favorite parts of what you wrote and the thoughts that I thought were most provoking. But let's say you're writing the 4th edition introduction for the paperback because it's a wild bestseller in 2030. Do you think that you're writing about Ukraine's entry into the European Union, or do you think that Ukraine will stay out of the European Union?
I mean, I try to grapple with some aspects of this issue in the new chapter for the paperback. I think that we cannot really overestimate what a huge change this war entails for the European Union's relationship with Ukraine. I mean, I think I would go as far as to say that most Europeans didn't take the idea of Ukrainian nationhood really seriously at all. In Poland, yes, but generally, maybe a few other places, but generally, at the core of the European Union, and indeed, I'd say quite a bit of German policy over a number of areas, not just the pipelines question, could be explained by the privileging of Germany's relationship with Russia over any demands of Ukraine to say we need some protection for our independence because we can't take it for granted, given the nature of Russian power. I think it's now incredibly difficult to think that the European Union can retreat from the fact that it's giving candidate status to Ukraine. At the same time, I think it's mind-bogglingly difficult actually to bring Ukraine into the European Union. And that isn't just actually like an economic question. It means that the European Union has to have a permanent way of dealing with the Russia-Ukraine conflict with Ukraine inside the European Union. And then I think it raises, even historically, a lot of questions about the ways in which the European Union has projected its own understanding of history, its own, if you like, historical myths, not quite the word mythos, let's call it that, about its origins as a peace project and as an absolute repudiation of the Holocaust as an end point in like European history. Ukraine raises all kinds of like difficult questions about being able to hold on, I think, to that mythos, because its position, it's going to end up, if it does end up in the European Union, it's going to be because it fought a war of independence against Russia. And it's got a very different history about the Second World War than Germany has, and these things are not going to go away. And European Union, and I'm not ambitious for that matter in this respect, it's got to work all this out at the same time as it's dealing with these profoundly difficult economic issues, the energy transition, and the whole disorder, in some sense, that has arisen in the world from the US-China conflict. So I still think in some sense we haven't all completely understood how much what this war has changed.
I mean, and we haven't even mentioned Turkey here, which I also thought you did a great job talking about how, yes, Europe is the peace project, but then it becomes a civilizational project and Turkey is on the outside looking in there. And I don't know, I mean, it would make a lot more sense if you had Turkish power integrated into the European Union, but I guess that ship has already sailed.
Yeah, I mean, I spent quite a lot of time on the Turkey part. I was a little bit frustrated in a way. I mean, that I usually, nobody asks me about Turkey. I spent quite a lot of time trying to think about Turkey. But what I would say is that I do think that there's sort of parallel stories. The Turkey story and the Ukraine story are parallel stories with each other from the end of the Cold War and the questions that they pose for the European Union and the questions that they pose for the European Union and its relationship with NATO. And I do spend some time in the new chapter talking about the ways in which really Macron's attempts to kind of like say that the Turks are just a big problem and we need to be more confrontational with them, not least in the East Mediterranean about some gas matters. That's a lot harder when the Ukraine war meant that Turkey played a really significant NATO role, particularly I would say in the first part of the war. And if we're now in a situation where well, who knows what's going to happen in the Middle East, but Turkey's very much obviously like a player there. As you know, I spent quite a bit of time on the Turkey, Syria, Turkey, Libya issues for this reason. And if we move into broader conflicts in the Middle East, I think they're very much going to come into play.
Well, and RDR, we can spend as much time as Turkey as you want. It's one of our favorite topics on the podcast. And from an investment perspective, at CI, we love Turkey. We think Turkey is going to be one of the main benefactors of this disordered multipolar world that you talk about. But I remember vividly that, before Russia invades Ukraine, probably one of, if not the biggest geopolitical issues on my desk was that incident where French and Turkish frigates lock onto each other in the Mediterranean over Libya, and here we are this week. I thought it was going to kind of go away, but France coming out and confirming, yes, we are sending weapons to Armenia, and we want to make sure that Azerbaijan, backed by Turkey, is not going to go and reclaim Nakhchivan or whatever else and continue settling scores. I'm sure that Azerbaijan would have featured well in your territorial chapter if you'd been able to get to it. So it seems very alive and very operative, and it's, I don't know, maybe Macron is thinking that the EU needs something to define itself against, and Turkey is a good thing to define your civilizational project against, but I don't know. It seems like the EU is picking a fight there, especially if it's going to be involved in the Black Sea Basin with Ukraine, that is not going to be good for it in the long term.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, is that you can't unpick Turkey's position in NATO, however difficult Turkey behaves as a NATO member. There's a reason why Turkey's in NATO. I think it's Truman who says that at some point when someone in Congress is arguing with him about it, just says, look at the map. And I think it's on the Macron issue. What's interesting is if you go back to like late 2019, or certainly the second half, from the summer of 2019, he's giving those speeches. I'm always trying to read the long speeches that Macron gives. And he was very much at that moment in his, we need to reset with Russia for civilizational reasons because Russia is part of European civilization. This was a big push narrative-wise, rhetoric-wise, that Macron was pushing at that point. And it went hand in hand, as you say, Jacob, with we're going to be confrontational with Turkey. Now, obviously, Erdogan was really up in the ante on the civilizational stuff there too. Like sending some of those warships into the East Mediterranean with basically with Ottoman admirals' names on the warships. But if you then look at where Macron was on Turkey at that point, that was the context in which he said that NATO was experiencing a brain death because of the Turkey issue, like in Syria. But he didn't have any. I mean, there's an absence of substance, I think, to these positions that like Macron takes. I see today he's suggesting that there's going to be an anti-ISIS, put Hamas into with ISIS into a Western crusade is not the right word, but Western effort, let's say, military effort.
It might be the right word.
He seems keen on these grand. I think they do have a civilizational component for him. But the bottom line here is his bet on the Russia one was just completely and utterly shattered.
Yeah. Well, and in that, I guess he has good company. Maybe we turn away from the explicitly geopolitical for a minute, because I do want to sort of set up the other really thought-provoking part of what you've said, which I think doesn't get enough. It doesn't get talked enough. It doesn't get talked about enough, and I also don't think it gets linked enough to geopolitics the way that you did. So let's just start with an easy layup question, which is, what is the concept of economic nationhood? I think when you define it, it'll actually be somewhat enlightening for listeners.
Well, I started with the idea that nationhood is itself, and by that I mean sort of an imagined political community. It's very much bound up with the history of representative democracy, and that it's quite difficult to understand both the emergence of representative democracy as a form of government, and the language that went with that, without seeing the centrality of the nation to that. And that in one sense, if you like, and this is a little bit like crude, but the sort of cosmopolitanism and imperial monarchy perhaps went together, and then democracy and nationhood sort of historically were bedfellows. And if we look at the ways in which the political leaders used the power of the state to define what the nation was, who was it the nation, they did a range of different things. One of which in Europe in particular was obviously imperial, is you rally the nation at home with the imperial project abroad. War is obviously pretty central to that, not least because if you have a strong idea of the nation, it becomes possible, the French Jacobin showed this, to like mobilize citizen armies. You can see that obviously in the First World War too. But certainly after imperialism and war of that kind has been utterly discredited by the experience of like the Second World War in Europe, you get a desire, I think, to use the economy and the idea of a national economy and the idea of citizens participating collectively in a national economy and having economic rights in relation to that, to be a substitute way of doing nationhood. Now, I think if we turn now to the United States, you can see pre-Second World War evidence of that very strongly. And it's, in some ways, I think it's the archetypal example, which is Roosevelt's New Deal. If you look at the language that Roosevelt himself used, it's very much like bound up with the nation, very much bound up with nationhood. And it's got a clear opposite, which is, a lot of the time anyway, which is international finance. You can see that in his inaugural address in 1933. If we move to John Maynard Keynes and Britain's negotiator at Bretton Woods, and you look at the arguments that he used for justifying capital controls, again, they're very much bound up with that idea of what I'm calling now economic nationhood. That if you want that to be like a national economy that will have some relative autonomy in relation to the forces at work in the international economy, then you can't simply allow the free flow of capital in and out of your country. So in that sense, the fact that in the Bretton Woods system that states had the legal right to use capital controls was itself, I think, an act of economic nationhood. And then what we've seen since the 70s is that in different ways that has either been dismantled, the capital controls aspect of it, or it's been eroded by international economic change in what usually gets called globalization. And that the idea that there's a political community that can be lined up with a national economy has become much harder to sustain. Now, if we then think about it in terms of democracy, I don't think the political need for nationhood has gone away. You still need things that bind citizens sufficiently together that they will accept when the other side wins in an election, particularly a consequential election, say like 2016. But it's become a lot harder and for politicians to do that. And I think one of the things that's then happened is as it's become harder on the economic side to define nationhood through welfare states, citizen economic rights, then you've had politicians who've been more willing to use nativist sentiments, appeal to nativist sentiments in order to try to rescue some idea of economic nationhood. But then that becomes very destabilizing because obviously it's exclusive in who it includes in the nation.
Yeah, and I thought your discussion of how sort of the economic disease of democracies, to use your terminology, was inflation, and that in the 70s you get rampant inflation, and the era of deregulation and getting rid of capital controls and more globalization, more free trade, that's about driving down the price of things. Because if you can get the cobalt from Congo and the Taiwanese can make the semiconductors and I can ship it over here, okay, like the iPhone now goes down to a price that anyone can afford. And it's striking to me that we're now back in a quote unquote inflationary environment, that all of the central banks are thinking that this is a demand issue and goes back to COVID, when really it's sort of a supply issue. We're deglobalizing, we're nearshoring away from China. Everybody's talking about economic nationhood in some ways. They're not using those terminologies. Modi says it's self-reliance in India, and Erdogan gets criticized by The Economist for unorthodox monetary policy, which is really just normal like monetary policy from the narrative that you're telling from back in the 60s and 70s. And I don't know. I worry that people have gotten used to lower prices for things. And the thing is, if you want to have more geopolitical security concerns, or you want to have more sovereignty, you're going to pay higher prices for things. And it seems like we're on this collision course where we're paying higher prices for things, but nobody is willing to accept that also that's, that inflation is going to be part of that, and the role that governments have in playing that. It just seems like we're headed for a collision in some sense. Do you have anything to make me feel better about that?
No, I mean, that is what if you want more resilience from geopolitical shock, if you want there to be more manufacturing production done in Western countries, not only for that reason, but also because you worry about what the political consequences of the deindustrialization of Western countries has been, then you're going to have to accept that means that at the very least there's going to be a significant inflationary shock while that transition away from the, let's use globalized for the shorthand, globalized and world economy, while that takes place. And the gains in efficiency, to use the economist's language, that globalization like brought are going to disappear. Now, there may well be good reasons for this. It may well. And it goes back to like the energy question. Do you want to make yourself? Does any country want to make itself like dependent upon supplies of energy that can be easily cut off, not just in times of war, but in times of serious geopolitical tension? Of course that they don't. But at the same time, is that's going to mean that the energy is going to be more expensive, and you can already see that in relation to the situation for European countries like Germany. Having to buy now liquid natural gas rather than the cheap pipeline gas that they were used to getting from Russia. If you want to say we can't have that relationship with Russia any longer for geopolitical reasons and because we're supporting Ukraine, then certain consequences follow from that, and one of them has undoubtedly been inflation.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't have said that any better myself, but I don't know, like, because how are they going to roll this back in some ways? Because if you have these national corporations that have become so powerful and which seem to transcend borders, I mean, they also almost become geopolitical actors in and of their own right. They're almost trying to conserve their position, right?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question that there is no way that I don't think we've seen enough to know what the answer to it yet. I mean, I think part of the future is going to be actually conflict between states, Western states, and big corporations of their own. Mm-hmm. So it's not at all clear that the American government can simply say, okay, we need to have a less risky economic relationship with China. And that means that Apple jumps into line and said, oh, yeah, of course, we'll change our entire, international supply chains to accommodate this new geopolitical preference. It's not going to work like that. I think the outcome of who is going to prevail in the end is still uncertain, and that in part will depend on how bad the geopolitical tensions become. But I also don't think that this is historically new, because I mean, if you go back to 1930s America after the Nazis came to power, there were still plenty of corporations that carried on doing business.
Yeah.
Including at times through the war, because it's not the case that the geopolitical completely overrides corporate interests. There will be a tussle, there will be a political struggle, there'll be part of the domestic politics of the country, as I think it was actually in the United States during the Roosevelt administration, but that too will become part of the world. And in that sense, the geopolitical logic is not determining of these things. There's still going to be a domestic political contest about what to do about the geopolitics and what corporate profitability, what maybe in terms of inflation, macroeconomically might have to be sacrificed for the geopolitical conflict to ensue.
Yeah, we're having Paul Triolo's coming on the podcast next week to talk about semiconductors in this vein. And I think the perfect example of this is both the Trump and Biden White Houses have talked about the trade war with China and preventing China from having the commanding heights of the new tech economy and using semiconductors as a lever against China. But then when the Biden White House actually announces the restrictions, they're much less than was rumored to be so. There are exemptions. It looks like indefinite exemptions for South Korea and for Taiwan. It's almost like the United States bluffed right up to the line and then realized, well, if the United States really does go after China in this way, we're going to shoot off our own foot. And suddenly the global economy is going to go into complete chaos. So in some ways, you sort of need a global conflict or something like that to do the reset. I mean, I guess World War II also happens in that context, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can see it as well. And over certain things, if you look at the history of leading up to World War II on the US-Japan side, then the question of what do you do about a country that's very dependent upon you for an import, in this case, obviously, oil that it is then willing to conquer to get if you're not willing to trade with it, but it also is the means by which you can punish it, try to deter its behavior. It becomes a terrible tangle, because you end up doing the things that actually incentivize the behavior that you don't want to see.
Where do you think the role of the dollar goes in the context of this? Because the dollar in some ways is the symbol of the system, and the U.S. hasn't really been willing to pull back on that. It goes back to the left hand not seeming to know what the right hand is doing. But when you start talking about the high debt levels that we've seen rising and inflation levels and debasement of currencies, do you have concerns about where the dollar, and I guess Britain went through this at one point with the pound as well, but I just wonder where you think the dollar goes from here.
Yeah, I mean, generally, that I am not of the view that there's much real risk for the United States of de-dollarization in the medium term. I think there's still a set of quite strong structural factors that privilege the dollar's position, not least really the centrality of the dollar in the euro-dollar markets and the importance of the euro-dollar to the way in which basically credit circulates in the world economy, and that the last massive crisis of the euro-dollar system back in 2007, 2008 led to the strengthening of American monetary power via the Federal Reserve Board, in particular the dollar swap line issue, rather than the weakening of American financial and monetary power. So do states like China, Russia and others have very strong incentives to try to find alternatives to the dollar? Absolutely. Have recent events amplified those incentives? Absolutely. If you look at what happened to Russia's dollar reserves that were held outside Russia in terms of the central bank sanctions that the United States and others put on. Would it be better for China if it didn't have to have as many dollars for buying gas and oil? Absolutely. But that doesn't mean that they can bring about a world in which that is the case. And that's partly because you still got to look, and it's particularly for China, what the incentives are for the commodity, in particular the energy exporters. So Saudi Arabia, on the one hand, clearly has wanted a somewhat close relationship with China anyway. You can see that over some of the technology issues. Saudi Arabia's been throwing a lot of money around over various investments over the last few years or so. Has it really been going to China? Not so sure. And why would it when China's got capital controls? I mean, they'd rather buy Newcastle Football Club, it seems to me, than get investments locked up in China. So the desire of the revisionist powers to find alternatives to the dollar isn't anything like a sufficient reason to think that de-dollarization is going to happen. I mean, obviously over a long enough time period, yes, but I mean, in terms of the ones that we can that we can think about, I'm not so convinced.
Yeah, and in some ways, China's more exposed to dependence on the system as it is currently than almost any other country. China is the benefactor of the age of globalization more so than anybody else. So if you're reversing it, it's why it's so strange to think of Xi Jinping as sort of the white knight of globalization. He's sort of the last one holding the line while everybody else is talking about economic nationalism again, which leads to one of the last questions I wanted to ask you. I mean, you talk about democratic instability. Do you think authoritarian regimes or democratic regimes are better suited to deal with these challenges?
I'm not really. I certainly don't buy the argument that authoritarian states have advantages because they have, in a way, an efficiency of decision making. I mean, particularly because I think that if you look at China, in this respect, which can get presented sometimes as a kind of engineering technocracy, it's also very clearly a form of government that at the moment is being legitimated by the cult of personality as much by any idea of technocracy. And that they, cult of personality legitimated regimes have got all kinds of tendencies towards instability. I'm not saying that because I think China's going to collapse. I'm just saying I think that we now kind of think of it as, there's a bit of a tendency among some people anyway to sort of think of this thing called techno-authoritarianism or something like that, and think that that's China and ignore the cult of personality aspect to it, and the ideological rigidity in some sense as well. Neither do I really buy the argument that like democracies are just sort of inherently better than every other form of government that's ever been. I think that we have to think about these things always like in context, partly in historical context and also in geopolitical context. So what are the things that democracies tend to struggle with, and how are they playing out in present conditions? And this is where I think that the United States is actually the clearest example of this, where we can see two long-standing, if you like, fault lines within the stories of representative democracies that really are at work in the US case. One of them is the problem of aristocratic excess. And I think you cannot really understand how Trump was able to win in 2016 without his ability to mobilize sentiments generated by that problem. Now, that doesn't mean that he wasn't part of aristocratic excess himself. He very much was, but he was kind of simultaneously acting as like a whistleblower from inside on it. And that was very effective. I think it was particularly effective actually perhaps in the winning him the Republican nomination. And then if we talk about the nationhood question, we can obviously see all the dangers that nationhood brings and the ways in which Trump was able to use nativist prejudices and resentments to win the election in 2016, and may well try to do so again. But I think we can also see, and I'd say that this is true of 2016 and 2020, without an idea that there is some kind of commonality of American nationhood, then it's very difficult to have election results where the losers consent to losing them and don't see it as incredibly dangerous for them to lose. And I think if we then think ahead to the American election next year, then this is very, very much, I mean, I kind of have a sense of dread when I try and think about the American election next year, because I think we can just see that the weakness of American nationhood in this sense that I'm talking about, it's serving this political purpose in representative democracies that allows for losers' consent. It's just breaking it's not there, I think, in the US, and I think that is dangerous. And so in that sense, then I think that democracies can have really quite profound problems in this. It's not inherent to the United States that its democracy is bad at dealing with this particular moment, but it is now where it is, and I think this is a real vulnerability for it.
Yeah, when I give presentations to audiences, I usually joke, I do geopolitics. I don't have to think about the US and the dumpster fire of its domestic politics. I get to think about the rest of the world. But I've had to change that in the last 3 months. And to your point, I put up the recent CNN poll about Democrats that believe the last election was legitimate and Republicans that believe the last election was legitimate. And I just say, these numbers don't work. If the other party doesn't think that you won the election, like the whole experiment could come crashing down. I've already taken too much of your time, but I would be remiss if I didn't close close out with just one last question, which is, you are sitting there in Cambridge. In some ways, the United Kingdom is an exemplar of all the trends that we've talked about, right down to economic nationhood, territorial disputes between Northern Ireland and Scotland and Wales, England, sort of the whole 9 yards, even though you don't use yards there. Could you just give me maybe a British perspective on this, or how you think about the future of Britain in the context of all the things that you've talked about? You're obviously on the outside of Europe now looking in, but are you part of the Anglosphere? I don't know. I'll let you take that whatever direction you want.
Well, I think a lot of the fault lines that we have been talking about have run through Britain, perhaps a little bit less so the disruptions around energy, where fossil fuel energy is concerned, because Britain didn't have the kind of close relationship energy-wise with Russia that certainly that Germany had. It's got long-standing relations with Qatar in terms of importing liquid natural gas. Now importing quite a lot of liquid natural gas from the United States. But I think a lot of the questions about the energy transition are very difficult for the United Kingdom, including because of its exit from the European Union. So what does the United Kingdom do about the Inflation Reduction Act and the implications of that, now being outside the European Union as a medium-sized economy? I'm not sure British politicians have got to grips with this at all. I think the aristocratic excess problems are really there in British politics. I think they were evident in different ways, in a number of different ways in the Brexit referendum. I think in terms of the future of the United Kingdom as a territorial union, I think the Scottish question has really been laid to rest for a while. I think that Brexit was actually ultimately good for the Anglo-Scottish Union, paradoxically. I think where Northern Ireland is concerned, now that's a whole different question. And I suspect that there is going to be quite a lot of the politics of the United Kingdom that is going to be dealing with the Northern Irish question for some time to come, and the possibility of a border poll. I wouldn't want to make a prediction about when I think that might happen, but particularly given how difficult it has been to keep the devolved institutions running, and essentially the Democratic Unionist Party is in some ways removing itself from being a party that wants to participate in devolved institutions in Northern Ireland, or at least on some quite clear terms. The status quo isn't going to be tenable, I think. I mean, obviously muddle through will prevail for quite some time, but that question of the territorial union for the UK isn't going away.
Yeah. All right, well, Helen,
probably should take the bit out. I mean, because the Macbeth thing, just take the Macbeth thing out, because I just it opens up a can of worms, and someone in Scotland will say that was unfair.
Oh, okay, I'll take it out, even though I loved it, but I can take it out if you want. Okay. Well, Helen, thank you so much for your time. I hope you'll come on and join us again. I thought this was really great.
No, I'd love to come back, Jacob. It was great. Thank you very much, and thank you for tolerating the fire alarm here.
Oh, that's fine. I love a little last minute hitch. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.